Quotes from Socratic Logic, the introduction section. Logic builds the mental habit of thinking in an orderly way. Logic has power, the power of proof, and thus persuasion. Logic will help you with all your other courses, for logic will help you read any book more clearly and effectively. And you are always going to be reading books. Books are the single most effective technological invention in the history of education. Logic will also help you write more clearly and effectively, for clear writing and clear thinking are a package deal. The presence or absence of either one brings the presence or absence of the other. Muddled writing fosters muddled thinking, and muddled thinking fosters muddled writing. In a small but significant way, logic can help you attain happiness. We all seek happiness all the time because no matter what else we seek it because we think it will be a means to happiness or a part of happiness, either for ourselves or for those we love. And no one seeks happiness for any other end. No one says he wants to be happy in order to be rich or wise or healthy, but we seek riches or wisdom or health in order to be happier. How can logic help us attain happiness? Here's a very logical answer to that question. 1. When we attain what we desire, we are happy. 2. And whatever we desire, whether heaven or a hamburger, it is easier to attain it when we think more clearly. 3. And logic helps us to think more clearly. 4. Therefore, logic helps us to be happy. Logic can aid faith. Even religion, though it goes beyond logic, cannot go against it. If it did, it would literally be unbelievable. Some wit defined faith as believing what you know isn't true. But we simply cannot believe an idea that we know has been proved to be false by a logical proof that is certain. Logic helps faith in 3 ways. First, logic can often clarify what is believed and define it. Second, logic can deduce the necessary consequences of the belief and apply it to different situations. For instance, it can show that it is true, that if it is true, as the Bible says, that God works all things together for good for those who love Him, then it must also be true that even seemingly terrible things like pain, death, and martyrdom will work together for good, and this can put these terrible things in a new light and give us a motive for enduring them. Third, even if logical arguments cannot prove all that faith believes, they can give firmer reasons for faith than feeling, desire, mood, fashion, family or social pressure, conformity, or inertia. Philosophy means the love of wisdom. Although logic alone cannot make you wise, it can help. For logic is one of philosophy's main instruments. Logic is to philosophy what telescopes are to astronomy, or microscopes to biology, or math to physics. As Thomas Jefferson said, in a republican nation whose citizens are to be led by reason and persuasion and not by force, the art of reasoning becomes of the first importance. It is obviously foolish to buy from every peddler of ideas that knocks on your mind's door. There are the 3 acts of mind: understanding a meaning, judging what is true, and reasoning. He who weds the spirit of times quickly becomes a widower, says G.K. Chesterton. I think I have never found anyone except a professional philosopher who actually used symbolic logic in actual conversation or debate. C.S. Lewis says of his own thought, to lose what I owe to Plato and Aristotle would be like the amputation of a limb. C.S. Lewis further stated or wrote that everyone knows the distinction of cogent reasoning from fallacy. The study of logic appeals to no criterion not already present in the learner's mind. This book's philosophy is Aristotelian realism. Almost 400 years before Christ, Aristotle wrote the world's first logic textbook. Actually, it was 6 short books, which collectively came to be known as organon, or instrument. From then until 1913, when Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead published Principia Mathematica, the first classic of mathematical or symbolic logic, all students learned Aristotelian logic, the logic taught in this book. Analogies do not prove anything. That is a common fallacy. They only illuminate or illustrate. Mathematics is the only totally clear, utterly ambiguous language in the world, yet it cannot say anything very interesting about anything very important. Compare the exercises in a symbolic logic text with those in this text. How many are taken from the great books? How many are from conversations you could have had? Many logicians now agree that the methods of symbolic logic are of little practical usefulness in dealing with much reasoning encountered in real-life situations. The old Aristotelian logic was often scorned by 20th century philosophers because it rests on two commonsensical but unfashionable philosophical presuppositions. The technical names for these are epistemological realism and metaphysical realism. These two positions were held by the vast majority of all philosophers for over 2,000 years, roughly from Socrates to the 18th century, and are still held by most ordinary people today, since they are so commonsensical, but they were not held by many of the influential philosophers of the 20th century. The first of these two presuppositions, epistemological realism, is the belief that the object of human reason, when reason is working naturally and rightly, is objective reality as it really is. The human reason can only be objective reality and can sometimes know it with certainty, and that when we say 2 apples plus 2 apples must always be 4 apples. Hume inherited from his predecessor Locke the fatal assumption that the immediate object of human knowledge is our own ideas rather than objective reality. What Hume called relation of ideas are essentially what Kant later called analytic propositions, and what logicians now call tautologies, propositions that are true by definition, true only because their predicate merely repeats all of the part of their subjects. For example, trees are trees, or unicorns are not non-unicorns, or unmarried men are men. Thus, the world of experience is formed by our knowing it, rather than our knowledge being formed by the world. Kant called this idea his Copernican revolution in philosophy. It is sometimes called epistemological idealism or Kantian idealism. Kant and Hume are epistemological idealists too. But if we use epistemological idealism to mean the belief that the human idea or knowing or consciousness determines its object rather than being determined by it, then Kant is the first epistemological idealist. The bottom line for logic is that if you agree with either Hume or Kant, logic becomes the mere manipulation of symbols, not the principles for a true orderly knowledge of an ordered world. Besides epistemological realism, Aristotelian logic also implicitly assumes metaphysical realism. Metaphysics is the division of philosophy which investigates what reality is. Epistemology is the division of philosophy which investigates what knowing is. Epistemological realism contends that the object of intelligence is reality. Metaphysical realism contends that reality is intelligible, that it includes a real order, that when we say man is a rational animal, for example, we are not imposing an order on a reality that is really random or chaotic or unknowable, that we are expressing our discovery of order, not our creation of order, that categories like man or animal or thing or attribute are taken from reality into a language and thought, not imposed on reality from our language and thought. There are 2 forms of metaphysical realism. Plato thought that the idea is that these universals were real things in themselves, while Aristotle thought that more commonsensically that they were real aspects of things which we mentally abstracted from things. Aristotelian logic assumes both epistemological realism and metaphysical realism because it begins with the first act of mind, the act of understanding a universal, or a nature, or an essence, such a nature of an apple or a man. These universals or essence are known by concepts and expressed by what logic calls terms. Then 2 of these universal terms are compared as subjects and predicates of propositions. For example, apples are fruits, or man is mortal. What do we have that no mere animal has? The thing that many modern philosophers vilify, abstraction. We have the power to abstract and understand universals. This is the thing traditional logic is founded on, and this is the thing that symbolic logic ignores or denies. All previous societies had a strong nearly universal and rarely questioned consensus about at least some basic aspects of a natural moral law, about what was natural and what was unnatural. There may have not been a greater obeisance to this law, but there was a much greater knowledge of it or agreement about it. It is not an unthinkable suspicion that one of the most powerful forces driving the new logic is more social than philosophical and more sexual than logical. The fundamental principle of utilitarianism is that an act is good if its probable consequent result is in the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. It is an if-then ethics of calculating consequences. Essentially, the end justifies the means, though the formula is somewhat ambiguous. Aristotelian logic naturally fosters a natural law ethic, an ethic of universal principles based on the nature of things, especially the nature of man. For its basic unit is the term, a subject, or S, or a predicate P, within a proposition, lowercase p, and its basic judgment is all S is P, a statement of universal truth about the nature of S and P. Reason used to mean essentially all that distinguishes man from the beast, including intuition, understanding, wisdom, moral conscience, aesthetic appreciation, as well as calculation. Reason now usually means only the last of these powers. Aristotelian logic is not exact enough for the nominalistic mathematical logician, and it is too exact for the pop psychology subjectivist or New Age mystic. I have found that students who are well trained in Aristotelian logic are much better at arguing and at understanding arguments than students who are trained only in symbolic logic. For Aristotelian logic is the logic of the four most basic verbal communication arts: reading, writing, listening, and speaking. It is the logic of Socrates. If you want to be a Socrates, this is the logic you should begin with. Logic should be not just a mathematically consistent system, but a human instrument for understanding reality, for dealing with real people and things and real arguments about the real world. All of logic in 2 pages. This is one of the shortest and simplest sections in this book, but is also one of the most important, for it is the foundation for everything else in logic. If you do not understand it clearly, you will be hopelessly confused later on. The ancient philosophers defined man as a rational animal. To be human is, among other things, to reason, to give reasons for believing things to be true. We can see common forms or structures in all human reasoning, no matter what the contents or objects that we reason about. Logic studies those structures. The fundamental structure of all reasoning is the movement of the mind from premises to a conclusion. The conclusion is what you are trying to prove to be true. The premises are the reasons or evidence for the truth of the conclusion. The 2 basic kinds of reasoning are inductive and deductive. Inductive reasoning reasons from particular premises. For example, I'm mortal and you're mortal and he's mortal and she's mortal, usually to a more general or universal conclusion. For example, all men are mortal. Deductive reasoning reasons from general or universal premises. For example, all men are mortal, to a more particular conclusion. For example, I am mortal. Inductive reasoning yields only probability, not certainty. It is not certain that all men are mortal merely on the basis that 4 men or 4 million are. Deductive reasoning, when correct, yields certainty. It is certain that if all men are mortal, and if I am a man, then I am mortal. A deductive argument succeeds in proving its conclusion to be true if and only if 3 conditions are met. These are the 3 checkpoints of any deductive argument. 1. First, all the terms must be clear and unambiguous. If a term is ambiguous, it should be defined to make it clear. Otherwise, the 2 parties to the argument may think they are talking about the same thing when they are not. 2. Second, all the premises must be true. You can seem to prove anything from a false premises. For example, all Martians are infallible, and I am a Martian, therefore I am infallible. Third, the argument must be logically valid. That is, the conclusion must necessarily follow from the premises. So if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. A term in logic is subject or the predicate of a proposition, a declarative sentence. Terms are either clear or unclear. Terms cannot be either true or false. For example, mortal is neither true nor false. The proposition all men are mortal is true, and the proposition some men are not mortal is false. Propositions are declarative sentences. They are either true or false. True in common sense usage means corresponding to reality, and false means the opposite. There is no one simple, infallible way of telling whether any proposition is true or false. There is, however, a fairly simple and true infallible way of telling whether an argument is valid or invalid, the laws of logic, which you will learn in this book. A deductive argument is logically valid if its conclusion necessarily follows from its premises, invalid if it does not. There are various forms of an argument, and each form has its own inherent rules for validity. All the rules for each form of argument are naturally to that form of argument and to the human mind. If at any point in this book you think that any of its logical laws contradict what you already implicitly know by innate common sense, please stop and check, for you must be misunderstanding either the laws of logic or what you think common sense tells you, for logic does nothing more than make explicit the rules everyone knows innately by common sense. Arguments are made up of propositions, premises, and a conclusion, and propositions are made up of terms, subject, and predicate. Terms are either clear or unclear. Propositions, whether premises or the conclusion, are either true or false. Arguments are either logically valid or invalid. Only terms can be clear or unclear. Only propositions can be true or false. Only arguments can be logically valid or invalid. So the three questions you should habitually ask of yourself when writing or speaking are of others when you're reading or listening to them are: 1. Are the terms all clear or unambiguous? 2. Are the premises all true? 3. Is the reason logically valid? If the answer to all three of these questions is yes, then the conclusion of the argument must be true. So in order to disagree with any conclusion, you must show that there is either 1. An ambiguous term, 2. A false premise, 3. A logical fallacy in the argument such that the conclusion does not necessarily follow from the premises. You will soon learn the rules of judging that. If you cannot do any of these three things, then honesty demands that you admit that the conclusion has been proved to be true. All this applies to deductive arguments only. Inductive arguments do not claim certainty. Last section of the introduction. The basis for the science and art of logic is two facts: the fact that human being thinks and the fact that thought has a structure. But from the viewpoint of logic, we distinguish three kinds of thoughts, three acts of the mind: 1. Simple apprehension, 2. Judging, 3. Reasoning. Simple apprehension is a technical term. It means basically conceiving, understanding, or comprehending one object of thought, such as a mortal, or a man, or a triangle with unequal angles. Computers certainly cannot do this. A computer no more understands what you program into it than a library building understands the information in the books you put in it. Judging is more complex than simple comprehension. Instead of just thinking one concept like man, it relates to two concepts like man and mortal. By predicting one term, the predicate of the other, the subject, in judging that. For example, man is mortal, man is not a triangle. As judging is more complex than simple apprehension, reasoning is more complex than judging. As judging moves from one act of simple apprehension, the subject, to another, the predicate, reasoning moves from two or more judgments, the premises or assumptions, to another, the conclusion, and arguing that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. A proposition has two structural parts: the subject term, the predicate term. The subject term is what you are talking about. The predicate term is what you say about the subject. The words subject and predicate mean the same thing in logic as in grammar. A term answers the question what it is. A proposition answers the question whether it is. An argument answers the question why it is. Terms reveal essences, what a thing is. Propositions reveal existence, whether it is. An argument reveals causes, why it is. Terms are not true or false in themselves. The propositions they are in are true or false. Terms are never valid or invalid. Only arguments are valid or invalid. Terms are either clear or unclear. Propositions are never clear or unclear. The terms in them are clear or unclear. Propositions are never valid or invalid in themselves. The arguments they are parts of are either valid or invalid. Propositions are either true or false. Arguments are never clear or unclear. Each of the terms in an argument is clear or unclear. Arguments are never true or false. Each of the propositions in an argument is true or false. Arguments are either valid or invalid. Most but not all of logic consists of deciding when arguments are valid. Valid is a technical term